Good morning. We're starting with breakfast at a petrol station today. It's early. I managed to get out of Warsaw before the morning rush and drive about 100 kilometers. We're off the rather busy A2 motorway, heading towards S8, and somewhere broke a glass. This S8 will take us into Lower Silesia, past Wrocław, or Breslau as it was known, into the mountains. We'll stop in Kudowa-Zdrój, one of the oldest spa towns in Europe. But we're not driving almost 500 kilometers to cure heart diseases. There are some really awesome picturesque roads over there, which should complement the new 911. That is, if the weather will allow us to see anything. So I'm constantly checking the weather app. Fingers crossed. Since we have something like 3 or 4 hours to our destination, I'll give you a brief rundown of what has changed, and then tomorrow on the twisty roads of Lower Silesia we'll try and see if these changes bring anything new to the table. And I do hope the cutaways, which you're seeing right now, include breathtaking views from the errant rocks in the Stołowe Mountains National Park. The 8th generation of what is probably the most recognizable sports car in the world debuted in late 2018 at the LA Auto Show. This model is known as the 992, and Porsche promises that the new 911 is even faster, more powerful and more digital. Which isn't saying much, because very rarely new models are less powerful, slower and technologically backward than the model they are replacing. It happens, but rarely. Since we're on a dual carriageway, there's no need to talk about power and speed. Yes, the 911 Carrera S now has 450 horsepower, 30 more than the outgoing model, a revised twin-turbo, gasoline particulate filter, still 6 cylinders, still 3 liters. The 0 to 100 kilometers per hour time is about 3.5 seconds with Chrono Pack, which this car has. More about that later. And now let's talk about the digital aspect of this car. Porsche 911 gets the same PCM infotainment as in the Panamera, which debuted a few years back. Perhaps this is why it still doesn't have Android Auto. Anyway, on this almost 11-inch screen, you can access most of the settings for safety systems and driver aids. Obviously, there is real-time traffic information as well as other online information. As long as you've got the SIM card in, someone has accidentally ejected this one and the press fleet guy has no clue what the pin is. But even without internet access, there is still a relatively up-to-date list of petrol stations, something that may come in handy even with the optional 90-liter fuel tank instead of the standard 64-liter one. The car returned to the press fleet office from some Porsche driving event, so despite resetting it, yesterday the trip computer still estimated 200 kilometers range on a full tank. 200 kilometers later, the fuel consumption dropped from some 14 in the city to about 11.5 on the dual carriageway, and I still have about 2/3 of the tank left, and the range displayed is now 244 kilometers. All this and a lot more data is displayed on one of the 2 digital screens in the instrument cluster. Porsche left an analog rev counter in the middle with a small digital speedo and a gear indicator. And there are 2 screens on either side which imitate analog gauges, or one can display only sat-nav map. And for some reason the outermost gauges are obstructed by the steering wheel and the driver's hands. This test car is equipped, among others, with adaptive cruise control, lane assist, as well as something called a lane change assist. Why bother with these driver aids in a sports car? Well, on a road like this, I don't really need to prove I'm an F1 driver. I really want to justify a 150 plus grand car, and it's hard if I can't drive it every day, can I? Here I'll tell you a story from a few years ago. I was on an assignment in Germany. We were covering the Hanover Tech Fair, driving every day from the guest house to the fair and back, about an hour on the motorway, on congested motorway, speeds between maybe 30 and 100 kilometers per hour, the same cars going back and forth to work and home every day. Now, this was a few years back, so adaptive cruise control and lane assist weren't commonplace. I mean, definitely not stuff you'll find on a compact hatchback. But being an automotive journalist, I spotted a 911 following the car in front at a very even distance and sort of swaying between the lanes. Now, when I got close to the guy, I looked inside. The driver of the 911, he was wearing earphones, he had a tablet stuck to the steering wheel, and he was watching some films or something. It's then when I realized that since a 911 driver wants to catch up on his sitcoms while sitting in traffic, then autonomous driving, it's just a matter of time.
And in order to better justify the purchase of what is today considered an ecologically challenged vehicle, Porsche offers you a CO2 calculator and a list of green initiatives to which you can donate money to offset your wanton driving generated emissions. Which brings us to the less sustainable part of this review. Don't worry, the roads I'm about to tackle are twisty enough to keep things legal but still fun, especially behind the wheel of a 911.
The Sport Chrono Pack includes this tiny dial on the wheel which helps you change drive modes, or it can activate the Sport Response button. That's 20 seconds of full attack! Just enough for a quick overtaking maneuver.
There are the normal, Sport, Sport Plus and Wet mode. The latter is to be engaged just before you wet yourself on a moist surface. The car detects water on the road through acoustic sensors in the front wheel arches. Therefore, it works even if there is no rainfall as such, which the wiper sensors would pick up on.
Wet mode makes traction control intervene earlier and cuts back the throttle response. You can activate it with the dial on the steering wheel, and the car will warn the driver the wet conditions are coming and suggest turning on the wet mode. In normal as well as in sport mode, Porsche 911 is somewhat held back. It's fast, albeit not fast enough to fall in love and sleep with it in the garage. Only in sport mode things get your pulse up. Obviously, Porsche cannot show you all its cards in the second cheapest 911. Porsche will gladly take more of your money and sooner or later will sell you something wilder. But for an average Joe with 150,000 euro, this should be enough.
Suspension. This test car is equipped with Porsche Dynamic Chassis Control as well as Porsche Active Suspension Management System, which lowers the ground clearance by 10 millimeters. In order to compensate for the low suspension, Porsche offers a front suspension lift system, which helps you overcome some steeper inclines.
Roads around the Stołowe Mountains National Park are better and worse. This half of the so-called 100 Corners road has decent tarmac, and you can open the taps between hairpins. Then braking, for Porsche, that's absolutely nothing, effortless. Accelerate on exit, repeat, great fun. Then the surface does get a bit rougher and it's wise to take your foot off the accelerator, not because the suspension can't cope with the bumps. For a stiff car, the 911 is quite comfortable. It's just that I'm worried I could lose traction, despite all the clever goblins doing their magic.
Steering. Porsche is good at electric power steering. It's very direct and you can feel it with every slight turn of the wheel. Standard cars get 15:1 steering ratio, while cars with rear active steering like this one have a 14.1:1 steering ratio. A couple of weeks earlier I drove the 4S and it was pretty boring. Things got a bit interesting when accelerating out of a corner, because this is where you can take advantage of all the traction.
Here, with rear-wheel drive, I can't fathom how Porsche manages to bend the laws of physics. The engine is mounted in the rear, albeit pushed forwards versus the previous generation, but it still should act like a pendulum. And even in the rear-wheel drive spec, 911 grips to the road, especially from the front. I mean, it's uncanny. This shouldn't be happening. From behind the wheel, I can feel how rigid the chassis is and how the steering is incorporated in this rigidity. The steering wheel is very hard to touch, unlike in many other cars where it's kind of soft. And all this adds up to the feeling of stiffness. It's hard to describe, but very coherent once you feel it. The gearbox is now an 8-speed PDK. Manual version will be available later because most buyers buy PDK anyway. And I sort of get it because you don't want to burn your clutch and play with a manual shifter when you're stuck in everyday traffic. But Porsche makes epic manual gearbox. I could drive all day long and shift Porsche manuals. That's how good they are. As far as the 8-speed PDK is concerned, gear changes, they're lifeless. It's nothing aggressive like in the M3. Perhaps Porsche wants to accustom its customers to the smoothness of electric powertrains. The sound. Allegedly it's good, but I was never a fan of boxer engines, so to me it sounds whatever. A bit too much droning at cruising speeds, and apparently the car has sport exhaust. Hear for yourself and tell me what you think. Porsche 911 is surprisingly easy to maneuver. Rear active steering definitely helps mask how big this car is. From the very beginning, Porsche 911 was bigger than it looked. The 992 is, of course, larger than the 991, but I won't give you the numbers, I'll just tell you. This car is actually only 3 centimeters, that's about this much, shorter than Mazda CX-5 and about 1 centimeter wider than the Japanese crossover. Wow.
Speaking of width, regardless of whether you choose a rear-wheel drive or an all-wheel drive car, the 911 now has wider rear fenders. I can't put my finger on it, but for some reason I like the 992 more than the 991. The 991 had a great looking targa, but looks were its only forte. I really liked the 997, not to mention the 993 or the 964, but that's a topic for a long night at the bar, not for a YouTube review. But feel free to drop me a comment below, what's your favorite 911?
I don't think I'd be very wrong saying the 911 changes very little from generation to generation. Usually going back 2-3 generations you can spot some minor differences from up close, but not from a mile away. The easiest way to recognize the 992 is by the vertical brake light on the radiator here in the rear and a light bar which beautifully joins the rear lights. And all this curvature here, it's just so sexy. Kids, stop watching now.
By the way, there is no dedicated button to lift the spoiler now. This function is available through the PCM, so your typical Porsche owner will now have to flip through menus on the touch screen. And no, you can't program the spoiler to the free function button.
The engine, the glorious Boxer 6-cylinder engine lives somewhere below these 2 air vents and a 3.0 S badge. I can't imagine how much time and money it takes to service this car. Where is the engine? Hello, Hello. Hello.
Another way to spot the 992 are the retractable door handles. Why bother? Wouldn't it be better to save a few grams? This car is half made of aluminium, but it's still heavier than the 991.
Briefly about the interior, these are 18-way adjustable sport seats with checkered Sport Tex upholstery. These two options will set you back around $4,000.
Porsche is supposed to be practical, so you can fit a couple of small kids in the back or lots of luggage. I did have a second car with a trunk waiting for me on the set, so I was able to take a bit more gear than I usually would for a shoot like this. And fitting all the stuff in the back seats and in the front is not a problem, it's a matter of access, but I fit everything I needed, and that's impressive.
For a sports car, the 911 interior is quite practical. There is a decent sized glove box, some sort of storage under the armrest, weirdly placed cup holders, whatever, usable door bins. Who says sports cars cannot be usable in everyday life? And Porsche also left the basic function buttons. You have to click to access more options here on the PCM, but the basic functions are accessible through these physical buttons. And for this, Porsche engineers, I salute you.
Porsche 911 prices start at €105,000 for a 385 horsepower Carrera. Adding an S to your Carrera costs €15,000. Also, in Porsche everything is or can be an option, so the price of this test car is around €150,000, and I'm not at all surprised. A few months ago I tried to spec a 991 Carrera, and for less than €120,000 it's a miracle it had a steering wheel as standard.
I don't know how to sum up the new Porsche 911 Carrera S. It's another evolution which gives you a bit more, but is it enough to upgrade? I think Porsches are cars for years. They aren't iPhones you need to upgrade every time a new one comes up to the market. And I wouldn't mind holding on to the 992 for a bit longer. And what do you think about the Porsche 911? Would you be okay with a regular Carrera or Carrera S, or maybe you're waiting for a more powerful version? Let me know in the comment section below. Subscribe, rate and share. New reviews every Friday. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Hopefully less foggy. I can see blue skies coming out. This is a little postscriptum that didn't otherwise fit in the whole review. Still, or back on the S8, driving towards Kudowa-Zdrój, and I just wanted to add a few things that I noticed about this car. First and foremost, the cruise control, adaptive cruise control. It's probably the best I've had so far. It's a sports car, I know, but still, it's very gentle in how it applies the brakes when it sees cars in front and how it accelerates later. So it's just amazing how good it is. And of course, in this car it costs probably like €3,000 or more, so that's 10% of a ordinary car. Options on this car cost pretty much as an pretty well spec'd Passat. But anyway, it's expensive, but you know where the money went, that's for sure. The second thing I noticed, a few weeks earlier I drove the 4S, and the 4S had this unpleasant tendency to float on the motorway. It felt as if the four-wheel steering worked all the time, so when you moved the steering wheel like this just a little bit, the whole car floated like that, and that was very unpleasant, and I didn't feel safe in it. And I tried it in various modes, and I think in the wet mode it was the least apparent, but it was there. Anyway, something I noticed, this is the 2S, let's call it, and no problem here. It's going where I want it to go. The third thing I noticed, I'm not sure if you can hear it, if the mic is picking it up, but there is some rattle coming from around the front right speaker. And I removed bottles from the door bins, I removed cups from the cup holders, and it's still there. The rattle is still there. It also happened in the 4S a few weeks ago, and another journalist who drove the 4S also spotted it. And we just assumed, okay, maybe that was the problem with that particular car, but this is a different car. This is a 2S, obviously, and it still has the rattle around the front right speaker. Now, I don't know, maybe it's the so-called pre-production car or something. On the spec sheet there is something called like launch model, so it's probably an early model, this car, and maybe it's an early problem, but at around 120 kilometers per hour on a dual carriageway like this rattle is very apparent and very annoying, and I'm sorry I have to bring it up, but if you're buying a car for 150, 160,000 euro, you want to know these things. This is sound consumer advice.